Swamp Creature Teacher by Chapter 1. Something Fishy. It was a hot and humid day at Murky Meadows Elementary School. The kids in Mrs. Marquila's class were waiting for their teacher, but she never showed up. Suddenly, a tall, thin stranger entered. She had big bug eyes and puffy lips. She was dripping all over. Drip, drip, drip. "I am your substitute teacher, Mrs. Gilman," she said. Two boys named Joey and Johnny were sitting in the back. Joey pointed to the puddle under Mrs. Gilman. "Look how sweaty she is." "She must be really nervous," whispered Joey. "I don't think she's human," Johnny replied. Joey's eyes went wide. "What do you mean?" he asked. Johnny pulled out a comic book. "She looks just like this," he said. "And our school is next to a swamp. It makes sense." "What's going on back there?" the teacher asked. "Something fishy," answered Johnny, holding up the book. The students laughed. Mrs. Gilman came face to face with Johnny. "Not in my class," she hissed and snatched the book away. Chapter 2. Swamped. The morning dragged on. Johnny spent it doodling in his notebook. He was sure Mrs. Gilman was a swamp creature, but how could he prove it? Finally, it was time for lunch. "Off with you kids," Mrs. Gilman said. "I need to eat in peace." Once she was alone, she dunked her head into the fish tank. Splash! Mrs. Gilman was enjoying her lunch when someone knocked on the door. Knock, knock. She didn't hear anyone until it was too late. "What are you doing?" yelled Johnny. Mrs. Gilman pulled her head out of the tank. "Cooling off from the heat," replied Mrs. Gilman. "I'm feeling a bit swamped." Then she cackled. Johnny saw a mouth full of very sharp, very pointy teeth. Chapter 3. Creature Feature. After school, Johnny and Joey followed Mrs. Gilman home. "Do you really think she's a swamp monster?" Joey asked. "There's only one way to find out," said Johnny. "Let's go." The boys didn't have to go very far. Mrs. Gilman stopped at the swamp near the school. She quickly looked around. Then she walked right into it. "I knew it!" Johnny cried. "Come on, Joey!" The best friends crept closer to the swamp. They did not see a large figure coming up behind them. "Gotcha!" boomed a deep voice. Towering over them was something out of a comic book, only it was real. "Swamp creature!" the boys screamed. The monster lifted them high and growled. "What are you doing in my home?" "Please don't eat us," Joey cried. "It was all his idea." "Hey!" Johnny shouted. Just then, Mrs. Gilman bubbled out of the swamp. "I see you've met some of my students, honey." "Students?" asked the monster as he dropped the boys. "Honey?" they replied, wide-eyed. "Yes, boys," said the teacher. "This is my husband." The boys were speechless. "The name's Finn. Pleased to meet you," the creature said. He held out a webbed hand. It was slimy and wet. Johnny shook it. Joey did not. Mrs. Gilman pulled out Johnny's comic book. "Hey, that's Finn on the cover!" Johnny exclaimed. "I thought I would surprise you and get it autographed." Mrs. Gilman said. She gave it to Finn. He stamped it with his webbed hand, leaving a slimy handprint. "I can't believe they're real swamp creatures," Joey whispered. "I told you so," Johnny replied. "And you are holding the proof." "Would you like to stay for dinner?" asked Mrs. Gilman. "Sure," said Joey. "What are you having?" The swamp creatures flashed their pointy teeth and shouted, "You!" "Help! Swamp creatures!" the boys hollered as they ran away. And picked up the comic book that Johnny had dropped and took a bite out of it. "That never gets old," he said. "Do you think anyone will believe them?" asked Mrs. Gilman. "They never do," said Finn. The swamp creatures laughed and dove into their underwater home for a relaxing night.